I'm not really the type of person who goes to parties. I've always been more of a stay-at-home kind of person, reading or binge-watching shows. But when Carol from accounting invited everyone to her open house, I figured it might be a good chance to step out of my comfort zone. This was back in late November last year. I had been working at the same company for 3 years, and aside from the polite hallway chats, I didn't interact much with anyone. So when Carol insisted on the invitation, I decided to go, along with 3 other equally introverted coworkers, thinking that at least we could stick together in case the party turned out to be a disaster. We got there around 8 in the evening. Carol's house was spotless, the kind of place that looked like it came straight out of a decor catalog. Minimalist furniture, strategically placed plants, and soft lighting that gave off a cozy vibe. At first, it felt like a typical gathering. Guests were scattered around the living room, chatting quietly, each holding a drink. But then I started to notice something off. The vibe was too restrained, like every word or gesture was carefully calculated. What really made me uneasy was the near silence, broken only by low instrumental jazz coming from a speaker. It felt like no one wanted to draw attention to themselves. After about 30 minutes of trying to fit in, I started to notice something that bothered me. People were checking their phones way too often. But it wasn't just that. Every time they did, it seemed like they exchanged these subtle looks with each other, almost like they were sharing some kind of secret. I mentioned this to Luke, who was in the corner of the room trying to look busy, fiddling with his drink. He shrugged, but seemed a bit uncomfortable too. "Maybe it's just in your head," he said. But I could tell he started paying more attention to what was going on around him after that. Things started getting even weirder when Julia, one of the coworkers who came with me, noticed that the scarf she'd left on a chair was gone. We searched everywhere, but couldn't find it. 15 minutes later, the scarf reappeared, folded up and placed on the back of a chair on the other side of the room. We asked if anyone had moved it, but the responses were vague, almost indifferent. It was like everyone was more interested in keeping their shallow conversations going than dealing with something so odd. That's when I started feeling like something wasn't right in that house. As time went on, more things started to disappear and reappear in strange places. Luke's keychain, which he was sure he had left in his jacket pocket, turned up on a shelf in the living room. My soda, which I had left on the coffee table, ended up in the bathroom. These little slips might have been funny if they weren't happening so often, and, more importantly, if no one ever saw anything. Carol seemed completely oblivious to anything being off. She kept smiling, walking around offering more snacks or refilling drinks. Then I decided to go to the kitchen to get more ice for my drink. The kitchen was just as spotless as the rest of the house, but what caught my eye was a pile of phones on the counter, all turned face down. It seemed weird, especially since the guests had clearly been on their phones just moments before. When I got back to the living room, I noticed something even more unsettling. Some of them were holding identical phones, but now they looked like they were turned on. That's when it hit me. I had this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched, but I couldn't tell by who or what. I decided to tell Luke and Julia what I had seen. They listened carefully, but Luke seemed skeptical. "Maybe it's just a coincidence. People have similar phones these days," he said, trying to sound logical. But Julia looked visibly uncomfortable and suggested we keep an eye on things. The atmosphere between the 3 of us was getting tense, and the idea of enjoying the party seemed far away at this point. We started taking turns observing the room, noticing every detail that seemed out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was intentional, like we were part of some kind of experiment we hadn't agreed to. That's when Richard, the 4th coworker who came with us, reappeared. He had gone to the bathroom and looked shaken up. "Have you guys noticed that there are no mirrors in this house?" he asked, his voice low. At first, I thought he was exaggerating, but after he pointed it out, I realized he was right. Carol had put up pictures and decorations where mirrors would usually be. Richard explained that while he was in the bathroom, he had the distinct feeling that someone was watching him, even though the door was locked. He even looked around for hidden cameras but didn't find anything. Still, the look on his face told me he believed what he was saying. After Richard shared his story, the tension between us became unbearable. We decided it was best to leave, but getting out without drawing attention seemed impossible. Carol was always nearby, watching our every move with that unshakable smile. We tried to make up an excuse, something like, We've got a busy day at work tomorrow. But she insisted we stay just a little longer. By this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The feeling of being watched seemed to intensify, like the rooms themselves had eyes. As we were getting ready to leave, Luke went down the hall to grab his jacket. He came back with a pale expression, holding a small electronic device that looked like a camera, about the size of a coin. "I found this in my pocket," he said, his voice almost a whisper. That was enough to make the tension explode. We all started rummaging through our things and found more similar devices in our clothes or bags. Richard found one inside his shoe. My heart was racing. There was no way this was a coincidence. Something was very wrong, and we were sure Carol knew more than she was letting on. The discomfort reached its peak when we realized the other guests had started watching us in a strange way. They stopped talking to each other and began staring at us silently, like they knew we had figured something out. Carol, noticing our unease, approached again, still with that smile. "Is everything okay, guys? You seem tense," she said in her sweet voice, but now it carried something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Julia, usually the calmest one, replied firmly, "I think it's time for us to go." Carol took a step back, still smiling, but her eyes revealed something else, maybe frustration or anger. As we headed for the door, we noticed the other guests had formed a kind of subtle barrier, like they were trying to block our exit. My heart was pounding, and all I wanted to do was run. The moment we touched the doorknob, the lights flickered, and the background music was replaced by a low, almost inaudible sound that seemed to mess with our nerves. Luke yanked the door open, and we all rushed out, not daring to look back. The night was eerily quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the heavy breathing of our group. Once we were outside, we moved away from the house as quickly as we could. The silence between us was almost deafening. None of us really knew what to say, but we all shared the same feeling. What happened inside that house was not normal. After a few minutes of walking, we stopped at a park to try to make sense of what we had just experienced. Luke threw the camera he found in his pocket on the ground and stomped on it hard. "This is an invasion of privacy. Who does something like this?" he exclaimed, still trembling. But none of our theories made sense. Why would Carol do this? And more importantly, how were the other guests involved? That's when I realized something was wrong with my phone. When I picked it up to call a cab, I noticed the screen flickering and that there was an app running in the background, one I didn't remember installing. It was a simple icon, just an eye. I showed it to the others, and one by one, they found the same app on their phones. The worst part was that the app couldn't be closed or uninstalled. Julia started crying, and Richard tried to stay calm, but the look on his face showed he was just as terrified as we were. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. It seemed like it had come with us. We decided it was better to go straight home and deal with it the next day, when we'd have a clearer head. I made plans with Luke and Julia to stay in touch through the WhatsApp group, but on my way home, my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I looked at my phone, I had this overwhelming feeling that the eye icon was watching me. The feeling was so strong that, for a moment, I thought about just throwing the phone away. But what if that didn't help? What if the thing wasn't just on the phone? That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up with the impression of hearing notifications that never came. My apartment, usually a peaceful refuge, felt noisier, like there were little creaks and whispers I'd never noticed before. The next day, I sent a message to the others, but no one responded right away. When Luke finally replied, he sounded shaken. "Something really strange is going on." My computer turned on by itself and started playing a video. It was a clip from last night's party, but the video was of us. What he said sent a chill down my spine. Someone had recorded everything. We were the targets, and this was far from over. After Luke's message, I rushed to check my computer. As soon as I turned it on, it froze for a few seconds, and then suddenly, a window popped up with the same eye icon that had been on my phone. My heart raced. The window flickered a few times before showing a video. It was the living room at Carol's place, seen from a high angle, like the camera was hidden in the ceiling. The video showed Julia messing with her phone, Richard pulling something out of his pocket, and then me. I was in the corner of the room, staring directly at the camera. The most disturbing part? I didn't remember looking up at any point that night. I shared this with the others in the group, but Julia's response was even more terrifying. Guys, my emails have started disappearing. Old stuff, personal messages, everything's slowly vanishing. It's like someone's erasing my life's history. That made me even more paranoid. Whoever was behind this seemed to be toying with us, wiping out our digital memories while leaving clues to remind us that we were vulnerable. We decided we needed to figure out what was going on, and despite our fear, we agreed to confront Carol. That night, we gathered our courage and went back to Carol's house. No one wanted to go alone, so we met up on the corner, ready to face whatever it was. When we got there, the house was completely dark, not a light on. We knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. We decided to walk around back and try to look through the windows. The house looked abandoned, like no one had lived there for months. The furniture was still there, but everything was covered in dust, as if the party had never happened. It was Richard who noticed the strangest detail. In the corner of the living room, there was a small camera, the same one Luke had found in his pocket. But this time it was aimed directly at the front door. The camera blinked, making a small noise, and a video started playing on one of the walls. It was the party again, but the footage was sped up. Guests were entering and leaving quickly, chatting, fiddling with their phones. When the video ended, a phrase appeared in white letters on the makeshift screen. "You have been chosen." The message stayed on the wall for a few seconds before disappearing, leaving the room in darkness again. No one said anything for a moment. It was like the words were hanging in the air, suffocating any attempt at rationality. Luke, who had been trying to stay calm until then, finally exploded. "Chosen for what? Is this some sick game?" His voice echoed through the empty room, but no answer came. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I turned around, expecting to see someone there. There was nothing. We decided to leave as quickly as possible, but as we walked down the dark street, something was bothering me. It wasn't just the fact that the house seemed abandoned or the bizarre video we had seen. It was the silence. The city seemed dead, like someone had turned off the background noise of daily life. When we finally got far enough away, Julia stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We stood still for a few seconds, but didn't hear anything. "Exactly," she said, her eyes wide. There were no footsteps, no cars, no wind, nothing. It was like we were in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. Not knowing what else to do, we each went home. We agreed to meet up the next day to figure out our next steps. But that night, things took an even more disturbing turn. I was woken up by a persistent vibration on my phone. When I looked, it was a message from an unknown number. The content was a short video, me sleeping in my bed, filmed from a high angle, as if the camera was on the ceiling. My body froze. Seeing myself, completely vulnerable, made me realize that it didn't matter where I was, they could reach me. The next day, the group felt different. Luke seemed more down, Julia was anxious, and Richard barely looked at us. We shared what had happened during the night, and each of us had a similar story. Videos, sounds, messages, everything pointed to the fact that we were being monitored 24/7. We decided to go to the police, but our explanations sounded insane. When we mentioned Carol's house, the officer looked at us with a mix of disdain and concern. "That house? It's been empty for years. The last person who lived there moved out a decade ago." We left the police station even more confused and terrified. The officer's revelation hit us like a punch to the stomach. We started questioning everything we had experienced that night. If the house had been abandoned for years, who was Carol? Who were the other guests? And more importantly, why were we chosen? Luke, always the more skeptical one, started searching the internet for any mention of that house, or anyone matching Carol's description. What he found left us even more bewildered. There was absolutely no information. It was like she had never existed. Meanwhile, strange things kept happening. Our phones began showing random notifications, messages that seemed written in codes or symbols no one recognized. Richard was the first to give in to fear. He deleted all his social media, threw his phone away, and disappeared from our radar. He wasn't answering messages or taking calls. When we went to his house, it was empty, as if he had left in a hurry. Julia started having recurring nightmares, always involving eyes watching her from all angles. And me? I felt like I was being watched even in my thoughts. Without Richard, our group began to fall apart even more. Julia insisted we should completely distance ourselves from each other, believing that our connection somehow amplified what was happening. Luke disagreed, arguing that isolation was exactly what they wanted. However, even he started changing. He avoided leaving his house, and when we communicated through messages, I noticed he was becoming increasingly paranoid. He said he felt like someone was literally inside his mind, planting thoughts that weren't his. I couldn't blame him. By that point, my own reality was falling apart. Everything around me seemed out of place. Objects in my house that I was sure of their location now appeared in unlikely places. My dreams were invaded by fragments of that night at Carol's house. Flashes of faces, fake smiles, and that damn eye icon. Even work started to be affected. Colleagues looked at me strangely, whispered something as soon as I passed by. I didn't know anymore if it was paranoia or if everything around me had actually changed. But one thing was clear. I wasn't the same since that party. At the point I reached, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers, and if that meant going back to that house alone, so be it. With my heart in my hands, I went there on a stormy night, hoping the darkness and bad weather would hide my presence. The house looked even more sinister than before, with broken windows and the front door slightly ajar. Between flashes of lightning, I saw what seemed like a shadow passing through the living room. I swallowed my fear and went inside. Inside, the atmosphere was different, almost like the house had turned into a completely new space. The walls, which had once been decorated with paintings and plants, were now covered by screens showing videos, all of us from that night. But what caught my attention the most was a large table in the center of the room, with objects I immediately recognized: Julia's scarf, Luke's keychain, and even a photo of me as a child. Everything was arranged like pieces in a twisted game. Before I could do anything, a female voice echoed through the room. "Now you understand, don't you? You're part of this." Frozen, I looked around trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one. "Part of what?" I yelled, my throat dry and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. The voice laughed, a cold, emotionless sound. "Something much bigger than you can comprehend. But don't worry, your role is almost finished." Before I could react, the screens began flickering wildly. The videos now showed images of Richard, Luke, Julia, and me. But they weren't normal recordings. They were intimate moments, things no one should have seen, as if our lives were being watched and manipulated all the time. I tried to leave, but the door I had left ajar was now locked. A suffocating feeling filled the room, as if the very air itself was against me. The lights flickered again, and suddenly all the screens showed the same image: a giant eye staring directly at me. "You'll never leave here intact," the voice said, now colder and more direct. In desperation, I started knocking over the screens and the table, hoping to break the illusion. When I finally managed to open the door, I ran without looking back, the sound of laughter echoing in my mind. When I finally got home, I locked myself in my room and stared at my phone, waiting for some sign, some message, but nothing happened. Over the next few days, I tried reaching out to Luke and Julia, but both had completely disappeared. No sign of life on social media, at work, or even at the addresses I knew. I felt like I was alone in this, and that was almost as terrifying as what I'd experienced in the house. That's when I decided to do something extreme. I changed my number, bought a new phone, and even moved to another city. I severed all ties with my old life, trying to start over. For a while, it seemed to work. The strange notifications stopped, the nightmares faded, and I almost started to believe that it was all behind me. But then, one day as I opened my laptop to work, there it was, the eye icon, blinking on the taskbar. No matter where I go or what I do, they're always watching me. To this day, I don't know who they are or what they wanted from us. All I know is that that party wasn't a coincidence, and sometimes, when the night silence is too deep, I feel like I'm being watched again, waiting for the next move in this never-ending twisted game.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've been living alone for 3 years in a small apartment downtown. I work as an analyst at a marketing company, the kind of job that consumes me from Monday to Friday, and sometimes even on weekends. The routine is intense, but I've always liked living downtown. It's full of energy, with everything happening at once, which made me feel less alone, even though I didn't know many of my neighbors. At that time, I was going through a particularly tough phase at work, with tight deadlines and a lot of pressure, so being home was my escape. That's where I could unplug, watch my shows, and try to clear my head. Then things started to get weird. It all began with something that, at the time, didn't seem like a big deal. One day, when I got back from work, I noticed that the building's front door was wide open. It wasn't unusual for someone to forget to lock it, but that night, I noticed something strange in the lobby. My neighbor from the second floor, Edward, was complaining that someone had stolen his bike from the garage. He was really upset, and other residents were there, discussing how they needed to install security cameras. I agreed with them but went straight to my apartment, exhausted. I didn't realize that something as mundane as that theft would be the start of something that would turn my life upside down. In the following days, my routine went on as usual, or so I thought. One night, I came home and felt like something was off. It was hard to explain, nothing seemed exactly wrong, but the atmosphere felt different, like someone had been messing with things that only I should have touched. My apartment has always been neat, almost obsessively so, and I noticed that some clothes in my closet were folded differently. What bothered me the most was that my favorite mug, which I always leave on the dish rack, was in the cabinet, upside down. I thought I was being paranoid or maybe just forgetful because of the stress. I shrugged it off, made myself some tea, and tried not to think about it. But it didn't take long for the coincidences to become harder to ignore. A week later, I found a note stuck to my apartment door. It was a yellow post-it with a handwritten message, "Do you feel safe here?" My heart raced. I thought it was just a bad joke from some bored neighbor, but I couldn't figure out why they'd do that. I showed the note to Edward, who seemed more annoyed than concerned. He said the building's security was bad, and I should complain to the landlord. I decided to take his advice and mentioned the note to the landlord the next day, but he just shrugged and said I was probably overreacting. That was the first time I felt like I was all alone in this situation. After the note, I started paying more attention to the little things. Every day, before leaving for work, I'd check to make sure everything was in place, the doors, the windows, even the alignment of the furniture. It became almost like a security ritual, but whenever I came back, something felt out of place. One day, the drawer where I keep important papers was open. Another time, one of the books on my shelf was out of order. Even though it bothered me, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. After all, it didn't look like anyone had broken into my apartment, and I was still locking the door every night. But deep down, I started to feel like I was being watched all the time. It was this heavy feeling, like a constant weight on my shoulders that followed me, even during the moments I tried to relax. So then, the messages started coming in other ways. First, a text from an unknown number, "Do you like the view from your bedroom?" My stomach turned. The window in my bedroom faced a narrow alley, and I never imagined anyone would be interested in that. I blocked the number right away, but the next day, I received an email with the subject, "Good choice of movie last night." The content was empty, but that was enough to make me tremble. I had watched a movie alone on the couch, and the thought that someone knew that terrified me. I decided to call the police, but they were just as indifferent as the landlord. "No signs of break-ins or direct threats, ma'am, there's not much we can do," they said. It felt like shouting into a bottomless pit. No one seemed willing to listen to me. After that, I started having trouble sleeping. The silence of the apartment, which used to be comforting, now felt full of noises. Creaks, muffled footsteps in the hallway, and even the sound of a clock I'd never noticed before started to make me paranoid. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was in my room. My body froze, unable to move, while my eyes scanned the dark room. The door was shut, like always, but my closet was slightly open. I was absolutely sure I'd closed it before going to bed. That night was when I realized something more serious was going on, but I didn't know how to prove it, not even to myself, that this wasn't just a product of my imagination. I decided to install a hidden camera in the living room. I didn't tell anyone, not even my coworkers, because I was already tired of hearing that I was overreacting. On the first day, I came home eager to check the footage, but there was nothing unusual. On the second day, the camera recorded something strange, a shadow crossing the room. It looked like someone bent over, but too fast for me to clearly distinguish. My heart nearly stopped. On the third day, the camera was turned off while I was out. When I reviewed the footage, there was only one last clip, 30 seconds long. The view of the living room was still until a gloved black hand covered the lens. I didn't know what to do. Whoever it was, they knew I was trying to catch them. After watching that clip, I freaked out. I spent the whole night with the lights on, a kitchen knife by my side. I didn't know whether I should leave the apartment or stay and face whatever was happening. The next day, I took a day off and went to a security equipment store. I bought extra locks, more cameras, and even a portable alarm that would go off if anyone tried to open the door. I spent the whole afternoon installing everything on my own, feeling more and more like I was fighting against something invisible, yet real. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, like no matter what I did, whoever it was had the upper hand. That same night, something happened that I'll never forget. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a loud noise coming from the kitchen, like something had fallen. I grabbed the knife again and slowly walked toward it, trying not to make any noise. When I got there, the air felt colder, and there was something on the table that I was sure hadn't been there before, another note. "Do you think cameras and locks will stop me?" the paper said, in the same handwriting as the previous note. That's when I realized the person not only knew my every move, but was taunting me, putting me in a game where I was nothing but a pawn. It wasn't just about being scared anymore, it was about survival. That morning, after spending the night awake, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag with some clothes and important documents and went to a cheap hotel on the other side of town. As much as I felt like I was running away, it seemed like the only sensible thing to do. At the hotel, I started to organize my thoughts. Who could be doing this? A neighbor? Someone from work? Even with all the possibilities running through my mind, I couldn't piece things together. So, I decided to go over the camera footage again, but this time I paid attention to something I had ignored before, the times. I noticed that the movements always happened within a very specific time window, between 7:30 p.m. and 8:15 p.m., when I was usually coming home from work. With this discovery, I decided to go back to the building and hide in my own apartment during that time. It was a risky idea, but I needed to know who was doing this. I positioned myself behind the couch, phone ready to record, and waited. Time seemed to drag, and the silence was deafening. Then, I heard footsteps outside. The lock began to turn, and my heart almost jumped out of my chest. The door opened slowly, and a figure entered, illuminated only by the streetlight filtering through the windows. It was someone wearing a hood and black gloves. The person moved with confidence, like they already knew the place. My body shook, but I managed to record everything while the figure rummaged through my stuff, taking pictures and putting something in their pocket. That's when the person suddenly stopped and turned their head in my direction. I thought my heart would stop. I froze for a second, but survival instincts kicked in. I jumped out from behind the couch and yelled at the person to stay still. In my rush, I didn't think to grab anything to defend myself, so I just held my phone up, recording everything. The figure took a step back, clearly startled, but instead of running, they started laughing. A low, mocking laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "You're smart, but not smart enough," they said, in a male voice, before running toward the door. I didn't have the courage to follow. As soon as they left, I locked the door and called the police again, showing them the video as evidence. This time, they took the situation seriously and promised to investigate. As the days went by, I started piecing things together with the help of the police. I found out that the man had access to the building because he worked as a delivery driver and had gotten a copy of the master key the landlord used for maintenance. He had a history of obsessive behavior and had been reported for other stalking incidents, but he had never been arrested due to lack of concrete evidence. The video I recorded was crucial in identifying him, and he was eventually arrested a few weeks later. Despite that, the feeling of vulnerability didn't go away. Even though I knew he was in prison, I moved to a new apartment. Living there would never be the same. Moving apartments was a relief, but also a forced goodbye to a life I used to enjoy. Now, living in a new place, with more security and away from downtown, I became much more cautious. I installed cameras in every room, reinforced the doors, and avoided creating a predictable routine. Still, some nights, I wake up startled, imagining I hear footsteps or see shadows moving. It's hard to fully trust the world around me after what happened. As much as the police assured me that the man would stay locked up for a long time, I couldn't feel completely at peace anymore. Sometimes, I wonder if he was really acting alone, or if there was someone else, something else, behind it all. To this day, when I tell this story, I see people reacting in different ways. Some get scared, others don't believe something like that could happen. But to me, it's real. I still have the video on my phone as proof that it wasn't just my imagination, but also as a reminder that danger can be much closer than we think. If I've learned anything from this, it's that we can never underestimate the signs, no matter how small they seem. Every detail could be the start of something much bigger and scarier. I just hope I never have to go through something like that again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I always knew starting over wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect it to feel so strange. I'm a single mom with 2 little kids, and I decided that moving to a new city was the only way to give our lives a fresh start. We found a house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees and peaceful streets, where all the houses looked the same, with well-kept yards and white picket fences. It seemed too perfect, almost surreal. But soon enough, I started to notice something unsettling about that perfection. It didn't take long for me to get the feeling that we were being watched, like our presence was uncomfortable for the people around us. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, something you go through when you move to a new place. But after a while, I realized something was definitely off. The first strange thing that happened was the arrival of a black car, parked right in front of my house at 3 a.m. I was awake, feeding my youngest, when I saw the headlights shining through the living room window. I figured it was just some random car, but the fact that it was just sitting there, with no one getting in or out, made me uneasy. The next morning, the car was gone, but something inside me stayed unsettled. It wasn't just the car. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone, that my family was being watched. And that wasn't all. Shortly after, I started finding anonymous notes in my mailbox, all with short and direct messages. Stay away from the back of the house. Who would leave a message like that? And what could be so important about that part of the yard that someone felt the need to warn me? The notes started showing up with strange regularity, always at night, and always with different messages, but with the same threatening tone. Don't trust the people on the street. You don't know who you're dealing with. The neighborhood isn't what it seems. I tried not to be scared, but each note seemed to push me deeper into a pit of distrust. I had no idea who could be doing this, or what was behind those words, but the feeling of insecurity started taking over me and the house. At first, I thought it might be some sick joke, but soon, things started disappearing. First, it was a pair of gold earrings my mom had given me, then an expensive camera I'd bought with a lot of effort. And the worst part, the doors and windows weren't damaged, no one had broken in. It was like someone was coming in while I was out, but no one had seen a thing. I began keeping an eye on the neighbors, something I would never do under normal circumstances, but the situation was forcing me to. The families around here seemed so perfect, with rehearsed smiles and friendly chats, but something didn't feel right. When I found one of the notes in a plant in my garden, which made me even more paranoid, I started questioning everything. There was a house on the corner where Mr. Carter, an elderly man, always spent hours sitting on his porch watching the street. He didn't talk much to anyone, except to greet people almost mechanically, but his gaze was the most unsettling of all. He watched me in a way that made it seem like he knew more about my life than he should. At that point, I didn't know who I could trust anymore. That night, After finding another note, something inside me finally snapped. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore, and that I needed to figure out what was going on. I decided to install security cameras around the house, something simple, just to catch any strange movements. When I reviewed the footage the next day, my stomach turned. At 2:45 a.m., a shadow appeared on the video, walking through my garden, heading straight toward the back of the house. But the weirdest part was that, in one of the shots, the man seemed to vanish into thin air, like he was slipping through some invisible space, only to reappear a few seconds later, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to scream, run, and get out of there. But what scared me the most was that no one seemed to hear or see anything, like it was all just some illusion. I was alone, and that made it even scarier. That's when I decided to go to Mr. Carter's house. I was nervous, but I knew he might know something. Mr. Carter always seemed so detached from everything, but somehow, he felt like part of something bigger, a missing link that could give me the answers I was desperately searching for. When I found him on his porch, he looked at me with those tired, deep eyes, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. I asked him, point blank, if he knew anything about the strange things happening in the neighborhood. His answer was simple, but it sent chills down my spine. You should have stayed away, but now that you're here, there's no going back. You're in now. He slowly stood up, without offering any more explanation, and walked into his house, leaving me there, alone, with a growing weight on my chest. The next day, my fear only grew stronger. I couldn't sleep properly anymore. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every noise made me jump. I decided to investigate further, so I started paying closer attention to the other neighbors. A group of women who often met on the corner always seemed to look at my house when I walked by. They were all married with young kids, and they'd always chat excitedly among themselves. But something about their smiles didn't seem natural, like there was a secret they were desperately trying to hide. I went to the neighborhood convenience store, a simple spot but familiar to everyone, and talked to the cashier, a young guy named Mark, who seemed to know everything about everyone. He told me, almost in a whisper, that some things weren't what they seemed around here, that the neighborhood had its own rules, and that I was starting to learn more than I should. Before I could ask more, he quickly changed the subject and said he needed to get back to work. That's when I realized something even more terrifying. The cameras I'd installed were gone. They had simply disappeared overnight, and the footage I'd collected was no longer on the computer. It was like someone had broken into my house, left no trace, and erased all the evidence I had about what was going on. The feeling of being watched intensified, and my mind started to race. The neighborhood felt like one big web, with everyone connected somehow, all of them knowing something I didn't. I couldn't trust anyone anymore, and with each passing day, I felt my sanity slipping through my fingers. Things had gone too far, and I knew that if I didn't do something fast, it would be too late for my family. I decided to confront Mr. Carter again, but this time, I wasn't leaving without answers. I was determined to find out the truth, no matter what it took. When I arrived at his house, the door was slightly ajar, as if he had been expecting me. I entered quietly, feeling a tension in the air that seemed to grow with each step I took. He was in the living room, sitting in a rocking chair, staring out the window, almost like he was waiting for me. "You want to know what's going on, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with an unsettling authority. I could only nod, my throat dry, almost speechless. He slowly got up and pointed toward a dark hallway, which seemed to lead to a hidden underground space I had never noticed before. "Everything you need to know is down there, but it won't be easy. You'll have to decide which side you're on," he said, his expression stern, filled with something I couldn't quite identify. I descended the basement stairs with my heart racing. With every step, a sense of dread overwhelmed me. I reached a heavy, rusted door that creaked open. Inside, I found something I never could have imagined. A kind of secret room, filled with papers, old photographs, and personal belongings of people in the neighborhood. It was like a secret archive, documenting every detail of each of our lives, including mine. There, among the items, were photos of my family and me, from the moment we arrived until that point, along with detailed notes about our habits, our fears, our routines. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around quickly, and there he was, Mr. Carter, wearing a smile that was no longer that of a friendly old man, but of someone who knew he had trapped me in this web. "You should have stayed away," he repeated, and I realized I wasn't just in a neighborhood anymore. I was in something much bigger, something I could never escape from. My mind was on the verge of breaking. The images and the notes were suffocating me. I was trapped, with no way out, caught in a web of lies and manipulation I never thought possible in such a peaceful place. I looked at Mr. Carter, who was still standing in the doorway, as if waiting for my reaction. But I knew I couldn't afford to let fear take control. I took a deep breath and asked, my voice trembling, "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out a photograph. When he showed it to me, my heart skipped a beat. It was an old photo of an unknown woman with the same eyes as my oldest son. "She was here before you, the last one who tried to escape," he said, his coldness freezing me in place. "Now it's your turn." In that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a prison disguised as a community, and I was the next victim. With Mr. Carter's words echoing in my mind, I started thinking quickly. I had to get out of there. I had to protect my kids before it was too late. I remembered the note I had found that morning, the last message that said, "Don't trust anyone." I knew I couldn't rely on anyone in that place anymore, and the only way out was to break the chain that seemed to be binding me to that hell. My eyes fixed on the door, I ran for the window, desperately trying to find an escape route, but before I could reach it, the door slammed open violently. I turned around and saw one of the closest neighbors, the man from the house next door, holding a key. "Don't try to run," he said calmly. "Here, everyone has their role. Yours has already begun." And at that moment, I realized that the real prison wasn't the walls of that house, but the web of lies and control that had formed around all of us. It was too late to turn back. I knew that at that moment, there was no escaping anymore, but something inside me still refused to accept defeat. The adrenaline flooded my body as I looked at the faces around me, all of them somehow complicit in something much bigger. But I also knew I wasn't alone. My kids were out there, and that gave me strength. So, I made a decision. I walked over to the table where Mr. Carter was sitting and grabbed one of the papers lying there. It was a list of names, and mine was on it, marked. I tore the paper and threw it to the ground without thinking. "I won't be another one of you," I whispered to myself. In a swift motion, I ran to the door, shoved the man standing there, and bolted for the backyard. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get out of that place. I heard their screams behind me, but I didn't stop. I managed to reach the street, and when I looked back, no one was following me. I never went back to that neighborhood. I moved to a new city, a new life, leaving behind everything I had known. But what happened there still haunts me. That neighborhood, that place that seemed so peaceful, still lives in my mind, like a prison of secrets and control. And even though I escaped, something tells me that the people who live there never really leave. They're trapped somehow, in a system they don't understand, but that controls every step they take. I found freedom, but how long will I be able to live in peace knowing that there are others out there who might still be trapped in that invisible web? Sometimes I wonder if I was the last person to escape. Maybe I wasn't the first.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.